Picture a place that should have been untouchable. A place where polished hallways carried the footsteps of legislative aides, where framed photographs of town hall meetings lined the walls, where every corner was bathed in the quiet authority of elected power. This place was not a border checkpoint or a dusty warehouse near the Rio Grande. It was the regional office of the Texas Senate in downtown Austin, a building wrapped in limestone and glass, a place the public associated with stability, order, and the carefully maintained machinery of state government. And yet on that morning, just after sunrise, its doors shuddered under the weight of a tactical ram, wielded by federal agents who had entered the building with a level of precision usually reserved for counter-terror operations. The breach began at 6:51 in the morning, a time when the city was still stretching itself awake. The streets outside glowed pale with the first hints of dawn. The air hung heavy with that warm Texas humidity that settles before the day's heat arrives. Inside the Senate wing, the corridors were silent, the lights still dimmed from the night cycle. Staff would not arrive for another hour. Phones would not begin ringing for 2. That silence made what followed feel even more violent, as if the building itself recoiled from what was about to be revealed. The first door gave way in a single, thunderous impact. Metal snapped, wood splintered, and the frame bent inward as though pulled by invisible hands. The noise ripped through the hallway in a shockwave that vibrated the marble tiles underfoot. Agents moved immediately, weapons low, shoulders tight, breathing steady. They did not shout. They did not hesitate. They flowed forward as a single, disciplined organism, built from years of joint operations between federal agencies that normally kept their distance from one another. This time their mission was shared. This time the threat was too deep to ignore. The office they entered belonged to Michael Rivers, the Deputy Legislative Director for the senior senator representing the state of Texas. His position was not ceremonial. He oversaw federal grant allocations, security briefings, border liaison operations, and outreach initiatives designed to build trust between the Senate office and communities across South Texas. He appeared at ribbon cuttings, veteran events, school programs, and town halls where he spoke with the calm authority of a man who seemed to understand the pulse of the state. Michael Rivers was the kind of official who appeared on local news stations with reassuring language about accountability and transparency. A man who shook hands with sheriffs and pastors and school principals. A man who, by every outward measure, embodied public service. This was the office federal agents were breaking into. Inside, everything looked painfully normal. Neatly stacked briefing folders sat on the credenza. A half-finished cup of coffee had cooled on a coaster beside a laptop. Framed photographs froze Rivers in the middle of public smiles. One captured him awarding scholarships to high school students. Another showed him standing beside law enforcement officers at a ceremony honoring fallen deputies. In every picture, he looked modest, calm, respectable, precisely the image that made him so effective in front of cameras and crowds. But on the conference table in the center of the room lay an object that did not belong in any legislative office in the country. A sealed courier box sat perfectly centered, like a package awaiting a routine signature. The box was clean, unmarked, official in the way that only government shipments ever look. It was the sort of parcel that arrived daily, usually ignored by everyone except the staffers responsible for distributing documents. And yet this particular box was the reason the building had been breached before sunrise. The reason federal agencies had spent months tracing encrypted messages and shell company transfers that led them not to a cartel hideout, but to this quiet room, 20 feet from a senator's desk. When the agents opened the courier box, the building seemed to hold its breath. Inside were 8 kilograms of cocaine, each one packed so tightly that the bricks looked like they were straining against their own bindings. The product was clean, high purity, unmistakably cartel grade. Next to the cocaine lay a 9mm pistol, with its serial number filed away until the metal was smooth and faceless. Beneath the weapon rested a thick envelope stuffed with cash, banded with rubber straps used by street distributors. Federal agents counted $39,000 in total before sealing it back into evidence containers. Then came the final detail, the one that shattered any illusion that this might have been planted, staged, or misrouted. Michael Rivers himself stood behind his desk, wrists cuffed, shoulders rigid, eyes hollow. The man who had spoken publicly about restoring trust in border communities, the man who had toured families through the Capitol building and promised to serve with honor, had been arrested barely 12 minutes before the breach team opened the courier box. He had been found alone in his office. His keycard logs indicated he entered the building at 4:15 in the morning, 2 hours before his usual arrival time. When agents confronted him, he offered no explanation. He said nothing at all. To the untrained eye, this might have looked like a calculated drug bust, a single corrupt official ensnared in a scandal, a shocking but isolated case. Yet the agents in that room knew better. 8 kilograms of cartel product does not appear by accident inside a legislative office. A pistol with erased numbers does not land on a table without intention. Cash wrapped in cartel fashion does not drift into a senator's workspace unless the channels that delivered it have roots far below the surface. The truth was already forming in the air like a storm warning. This was not misbehavior. It was not desperation. It was infiltration wearing a professional smile. It was corruption dressed in a tailored suit and polished shoes. It was a network moving quietly through the arteries of government buildings that were supposed to be impenetrable to outside forces. The forensic specialists were the first to understand the magnitude of what they were seeing. They photographed everything, tagged evidence, logged timestamps with meticulous care. Nothing about the scene felt improvised. Everything was deliberate, as if the office itself had been repurposed into a staging point for a narcotics pipeline that no one in the public could have imagined. The location made it worse. This was not a border truck stop or a remote stash house near Laredo. This was the symbolic heart of Texas political authority. It was a place parents brought their children during school trips, a place where laws were shaped and decisions affecting millions were finalized, a space meant to embody accountability and transparency, now revealed to be a polished, climate-controlled extension of a cartel distribution network. As technicians sealed the courier box and lifted it into a reinforced container, an unspoken truth filled the room. The cocaine was not the story. The pistol was not the story. The cash was not the story. The real story was what these items represented. If a deputy legislative director could move narcotics through government channels without triggering alarms, then the boundary between criminal enterprise and political authority had thinned to the width of a single locked door. And that door had finally been forced open. This was not an outside force breaking in. It was an inside force breaking out. The collapse of trust does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives like this, quietly, unexpectedly, in a room that should have symbolized integrity, in the hands of a man who had built a public image on promises of service. And it was only the beginning. The truth did not emerge with a confession. It began with a machine's breath, the quiet hum of cooling fans inside a federal cyber forensics lab where Michael Rivers' devices were laid out like surgical patients awaiting examination. His laptop, a slim, government-issued model with an unremarkable gray casing, looked like the sort of tool used for scheduling hearings, drafting memos, and corresponding with municipal leaders. Nothing about its appearance suggested danger or treason. Yet from the moment the agents opened the lid, they understood they were not dealing with ordinary concealment. The screen did not display a login prompt. It did not show a familiar desktop. Instead, it lit up with a blank field of black, a thin, vertical line blinking in the corner like the pulse of a machine daring them to take another step. The cyber team began their work before sunrise, a row of specialists sitting beneath harsh fluorescent lights that reflected off metal desks and racks of equipment. They recognized the architecture almost immediately. Layers upon layers of encryption, each folding into another like armored plates on a tank. Government laptops rarely carried protection this advanced. The configuration reminded them of secured systems used in foreign intelligence operations, where a single attempt at the wrong password could wipe the drive clean. For hours, lines of code cascaded across multiple screens, shifting and multiplying as if resisting capture. The room filled with the soft clicking of keyboards, the steady rise and fall of technical murmurs. the tension of a team who knew that somewhere inside the encrypted maze was the truth of how deeply the infection had spread. It was nearly midday when the final lock broke. The moment was silent, almost anticlimactic. A small icon appeared in the corner of the screen, followed by a directory with a simple title that meant nothing to an outsider. But the agents understood. The folders displayed were not random data dumps or administrative clutter. They were organized, methodical, precise. A digital map of movement logs, coded shipping manifests, financial entries disguised as public expenditures, internal memos rewritten into shorthand that analysts instantly recognized as cartel communication language. None of it matched the responsibilities of a deputy legislative director. All of it pointed to the existence of something far larger than a single corrupt official. The shipping logs were the first to make every agent in the room lean closer. 19 individual entries, each marking a transaction, each labeled by date and time, each disguised inside legitimate state operations. The earliest file was time-stamped 14 months earlier, long before Rivers had been identified as a person of interest. Each shipment carried ambiguous titles that meant nothing in government work. Packet 1, Revision 3, Courier 7. Behind these harmless labels was a horrifying truth. Every shipment represented between 8 and 20 kilograms of narcotics. Not border seizures, not lost evidence, not confiscated materials. These were deliberate transfers, passed directly through official routes under the guise of state operations. Trucks that delivered prosthetic equipment to rural clinics carried sealed containers of crystal meth, hidden under documentation stamped with the Senate office seal. Packages routed through the legislative mailroom contained counterfeit medication, pills so expertly pressed they were indistinguishable from legal prescriptions. Vitamin supplement shipments were padded with fentanyl-laced products, so lethal a single miscalculation could have killed entire classrooms. The cartel had not smuggled its product through shadows. It had smuggled it through legitimacy. Agents traced the path of the shipments, watching red markers appear across a digital map of Texas. San Antonio, Waco, El Paso, Laredo, Beaumont. Even small towns that barely dotted the highway system. Each point was a node in the network Rivers had helped maintain. Some shipments traveled across state lines into New Mexico and Louisiana, using interagency agreements as camouflage. Every route was built with the precision of a logistic company, not the chaos of street-level dealers. Every destination had the appearance of normalcy, a storefront or storage unit or administrative facility that drew no attention. The cartel had replaced back-alley exchanges with paperwork, signatures, and the comfort of state seals. The more the agents read, the more the implications grew. These were not criminals sneaking product past inattentive guards. These were individuals with badges, credentials, access codes, and the authority to move freely through restricted areas. The logs named no officials directly, but the patterns were unmistakable. Someone inside the government had provided clearance. Someone had approved shipments without inspection. Someone had maintained a smooth logistical path that could only exist if multiple people across different departments had agreed to look away at the right moments. Then came the messages. Encrypted threads buried under Rivers's official communications, disguised as fragments of draft legislation and annotated memos. When decrypted, the text shifted from bureaucratic language to terse, coded exchanges referencing people, locations, and contingencies. Some messages described delays in transport routes. Others referenced new containers arriving from across the border. One message, time-stamped only 7 days before Rivers's arrest, contained a phrase that made the entire room fall still. It referenced a target, described as the final obstacle, and included a word that removed any ambiguity. Removal. Not persuasion, not pressure. Removal. Analysts recognized the syntax immediately. It was language used by cartel intermediaries when discussing sanctioned killings. This was not corruption motivated by greed. It was infiltration, designed to eliminate opposition. For a moment, no one in the lab spoke. The implications rose like a black tide, drowning the comfortable belief that the government had merely been exploited. The government had been penetrated. Its systems had been repurposed. Its offices had become conduits. And one of its own legislative officers had participated in preparations for assassination. The discovery ignited a new phase of analysis. Agents traced financial records next, following money disguised as community development funds and outreach grants. The numbers had been altered in ways subtle enough that only trained forensic accountants could recognize them. Payments routed through nonprofit organizations appeared ordinary on the surface, but beneath the surface, the donors did not exist. The addresses were abandoned lots, and the signatures were manufactured. The funds went to contractors who performed no work. They supported initiatives that produced no results. They were siphoned into accounts connected to shell companies in states known for permissive corporate anonymity laws. The money did not move like political donations. It moved like laundered drug revenue. Every investigator in the room understood what this meant. The cartel had not merely benefited from corruption, it had engineered it. It had built a financial ecosystem within the state's own administrative bloodstream. And Michael Rivers, the smiling, soft-spoken deputy director who had appeared on morning news shows speaking about integrity, had been one of the key nodes keeping that ecosystem alive. As the sun began to set outside the windows of the cyber lab, the scale of the operation became undeniable. The cartel no longer existed at the margins of society. It lived inside the framework of public trust. It exploited systems designed to serve communities. It used offices meant for governance to move the same poison that was killing young people in every corner of the state. Its greatest power was not violence or intimidation. It was its ability to blend into normal life so completely that no one questioned its presence. By the time the last file was cataloged, one truth stood above all others. The shipments, the codes, the money, the encrypted threats, the quiet assistance from people with official titles. These were not fragments of a broken system. They were parts of an organized structure, a structure hiding in plain sight, a structure nourished by individuals who wore suits, carried identification badges, and walked through government halls without suspicion. What had begun as an arrest now resembled the early tremor of an earthquake. The foundation had cracked, and soon the entire structure around it would begin to shift. Night fell across Texas like a curtain pulled tight, but the darkness did not bring silence. It brought movement. It brought tension. It brought the quiet hum of engines, the low murmur of encrypted radios, and the heavy presence of teams preparing to strike before the state even realized how deeply it had been compromised. The investigation into Michael Rivers had stopped being an analysis of corruption. It had shifted into something else entirely, something urgent and explosive. The evidence from his encrypted laptop had revealed the first layer of a network that threaded through cities, counties, rural stretches of highway, and dozens of seemingly harmless businesses. When federal analysts mapped the connections onto a digital model, the entire state lit up with points of contamination. Each point was a location where the cartel La Sangre Nueva had embedded itself behind a legitimate front, and each one represented a threat that could not be ignored for another hour. The command center was a reinforced federal installation outside San Marcos, a place intentionally chosen because it sat at a crossroads between Austin, San Antonio, and the border regions where the cartel's grip was strongest. Screens filled every wall, each displaying live surveillance feeds, satellite overlays, thermal imagery, and internal floor plans of targeted locations. The atmosphere inside the room was electric, heavy with anticipation. Dozens of agents stood poised at their stations, waiting for the word to move. Federal raid teams in dark gear checked their equipment one final time. Helicopter crews ran through pre-flight protocols. Tactical medics tightened straps on their packs. The air vibrated with the quiet intensity of a storm that had not yet broken. At 2:30 in the morning, the final intelligence report arrived from the cyber unit. All targets confirmed, all surveillance feeds stable, all entry points mapped. The network had been cataloged down to its smallest details. There would be no more waiting. The order was dispatched across secure channels, and within minutes, the night shifted. Vehicles rolled out of hidden garages. Helicopter blades began to turn. Tactical teams moved with the fluid precision of people who had trained for years to step into danger without hesitation. Across 14 separate locations, from industrial zones outside San Antonio to agricultural warehouses near Laredo, to a quiet set of storage units in East Austin. Federal units closed in with relentless speed. The first raid erupted in the outskirts of San Antonio. A warehouse that advertised itself as a freight distribution center sat behind a chain-link fence, its windows glowing with soft yellow light. From the outside, it appeared harmless, a place where forklifts moved crates and drivers prepared early morning transport runs. But beneath its polished surface was a hidden, compartmentalized structure, built to store narcotics, weapons, and cash. Federal agents approached the doors in a tight formation, boots moving in perfect rhythm across the asphalt. A breaching device flashed, and in an instant, the steel frame of the warehouse's main entrance folded inward, as though it were made of thin aluminum. The concussion shook dust from the rafters, setting off a cascade of echoes that bounced through the cavernous interior. Inside, chaos erupted. Men at the loading dock scrambled toward a side exit, their hands reaching for rifles hidden beneath tarps. But they never made it far. Federal teams surged into the room, their movements clean and controlled, absorbing the uncertainty with trained discipline. Stun grenades exploded in bursts of white light, swallowing the warehouse in a blinding flash that left shadows frozen in stark silhouettes. The suspects fell before they understood what was happening, their weapons sliding across the floor as agents secured the scene. When the dust settled, the truth revealed itself. Stacks of wooden pallets had been hollowed out and filled with bricks of cocaine. Crates labeled as construction materials contained fentanyl pressed into counterfeit medication bottles. A shipping schedule on the wall displayed routes disguised as routine building supply runs, each one timed to coincide with legitimate deliveries that would draw no suspicion from state regulators. Almost simultaneously, another raid ignited in a different corner of the state. This time, it was a cluster of storage units outside Laredo, nestled in a quiet industrial lot where families sometimes stored holiday decorations, construction equipment, or furniture during moves. But one row of units had been rented under a corporate name that did not appear on any Texas tax records. Through thermal scans, agents had identified unusual heat signatures consistent with chemical storage. When the strike team breached the units, they discovered the source. Hidden behind false walls were barrels of precursor chemicals imported from Mexico, along with large quantities of methamphetamine crystals, packed in vacuum-sealed bags. The setup was not amateur. It was engineered with chemical-grade safety systems, as if designed by someone familiar with industrial operations. This was not a temporary stash. It was a hub. The third location, an unassuming farmhouse on a rural highway near Giddings, turned out to be one of the most significant. By day, the property appeared like any other piece of countryside. A barn, a field of dormant soil, an aging pickup truck parked beside a fence. But beneath the barn floor was a fully operational packing site. Dozens of sealed containers held cocaine, disguised as agricultural additives. A conveyor system ran through the length of the barn, designed to load shipments into trucks without anyone noticing. The farm had received state agricultural development grants approved through the Senate office where Michael Rivers worked. What seemed like community support had actually been a camouflage for cartel logistics. In East Austin, the operation turned violent. A set of small garages connected by a narrow alley served as one of the cartel's distribution points. When federal surveillance flagged sudden movement inside, it signaled that the suspects had detected the approaching teams. 3 figures bolted from the building, sprinting toward the alley where they had escaped many times before. Their footsteps splashed through puddles left from a recent rain, and for a brief moment, they believed their familiarity with the neighborhood would buy them time. But the sky split with the roar of a helicopter descending over the rooftops, its rotor wash slamming against the metal garage doors. Dust spiraled upward, lights flickered, and power lines trembled under the force of the downdraft. The suspects froze, stunned by the mechanical beast hovering above them. The loudspeaker commands reverberated against the brick walls, shaking the alley like thunder rolling through a canyon. Fear surged through the suspects, but fear gave way to desperation, and desperation ignited gunfire. The exchange lasted 9 minutes that stretched into eternity. Muzzle flashes lit the alley like stuttering lightning. Bullets ricocheted off dumpsters, creating sparks that danced across the pavement. Agents took cover behind barriers, advancing with calm, deliberate precision. The suspects fired wildly, their hands shaking, their attempts at escape collapsing under the coordinated advance of trained professionals. Glass shattered above them as a stray round struck a window. The helicopter maintained its position, the downforce creating a storm of dust and debris that blurred the edges of the battle. When the final shot faded, silence settled over the alley like ash after a fire. 3 suspects lay motionless. 2 more dropped their weapons, realizing there was no path forward, no alley left unmonitored, no direction that did not lead to capture. Meanwhile, in Pasadena near Houston, a warehouse disguised as a food donation center revealed its grim secret. Behind stacks of canned goods and frozen vegetables were cold storage vaults holding bundles of narcotics wrapped with coded symbols indicating purity levels and final destinations. Volunteers who had visited the warehouse believed they were helping families in need. In reality, they had walked unknowingly past millions of dollars in drugs hidden behind a veneer of charity. In every location across the state, the pattern was identical. A legitimate front masking an illegal core. A system built to merge seamlessly with normal life. An empire camouflaged as community service, business development, or agriculture. And at the heart of the empire was the implication the investigators could no longer ignore. None of these operations could have functioned without assistance from people in positions of trust. By sunrise, the true scale of the night became heartbreakingly clear. Dozens of arrests, more than a ton of narcotics seized, weapons traced to military sources in South America, ledgers containing initials and coded payment routes. It was not a collection of independent criminals. It was an infrastructure woven through towns and cities, sustained by the cooperation of people who should have been protecting the state, not poisoning it. But the raids also revealed something more important than drugs or weapons. They exposed where the network was strongest and where it was vulnerable. For every fortified building, there was a single point of access. For every elaborate distribution route, there was a single signature authorizing its passage. The entire operation depended on a surprisingly small number of insiders, whose removal would shake the structure at its foundation. The federal teams understood then that the night's raids were not the conclusion. They were only the opening strike in a war that would reach deeper into the institutions that Texans trusted every day. The silence that followed the raids did not feel like victory. It felt like revelation. The state had not been infiltrated from the outside. It had been hollowed out from within. And now, with the first layer stripped away, the investigators could see clearly what they were truly confronting. A system built to look like home. A system strengthened by trust. A system that thrived because no one ever imagined it could exist in the first place. That illusion had finally shattered. And the next phase would demand something far more difficult than breaching doors or seizing drugs. It would require tearing corruption out of the places where it had learned to live undetected. Inside offices, inside departments, inside uniforms, inside the people meant to protect the state itself. The morning after the raids, Texas woke to headlines that barely scratched the surface of what had happened during the night. News networks spoke cautiously, their anchors repeating phrases like coordinated enforcement action and ongoing investigation. But inside the Federal Analysis Center, where the air still smelled faintly of burned electronics and stale coffee, the truth felt much heavier. The raids had been spectacular in their scale, yet they revealed only the outer shell of something far more sophisticated. The seizure counts, the arrests, the warehouse inventories, all of it was only a symptom. The disease itself lived in the flow of money, hidden under the language of civic improvement and community investment. The financial team began their work before dawn, pulling every document, ledger, receipt, and transfer uncovered during the raids. They traced bank accounts belonging to corporate entities that did not exist outside of a folder on a hard drive. They followed donation records from charitable organizations that displayed photographs of smiling children and outreach events, yet had no employees, no real addresses, no audited expenses. They examined contracts issued to construction companies that had never built anything. Each document was a tile in a mosaic of deceit, and when assembled, the picture was unmistakable. La Sangre Nueva had learned that corruption did not need to hide in darkness. It could hide in daylight, wrapped in the language of generosity and public service. The most disturbing discovery came from a non-profit registered as the Border Community Relief Foundation. On paper, it funded youth programs, educational grants, health initiatives, and disaster support. Its website displayed carefully staged photos of volunteers handing out supplies at community drives. But behind that pleasant veneer was a network of falsified donors, phantom addresses, and millions of dollars in unexplained incoming transfers. Those funds were then redistributed as consulting fees, educational stipends, and community partnership grants. In reality, the money was bribe capital, used to secure loyalty from local officials, award contracts to cooperating companies, and purchase silence from those who suspected something was wrong but lacked proof. 2 private casinos in El Paso revealed even more. They operated behind unmarked doors with no signage and no advertisements, accessible only through controlled invitations. Their gaming floors had no crowds, no noise, and no flashing lights. Instead, they functioned as silent conversion chambers where cartel cash became casino chips, and casino chips became digital credits laundered through shell corporations in Nevada, Delaware, and Puerto Rico. The money did not pass through the financial system with alarms or red flags. It slid through seamless channels, as silent and invisible as water flowing through a crack in concrete. When investigators connected the casino network to the fake nonprofit, and then to the records pulled from Michael Rivers's laptop, a chilling pattern emerged. The cartel had not bribed officials one by one. It had built an ecosystem that encouraged participation. It paid for school supply drives, sponsored local festivals, and donated to church renovations. It funded mentoring programs, community gardens, and youth sports leagues. At every turn, it created goodwill that disguised its true nature. Parents saw free backpacks for their children. Pastors saw someone covering the cost of repairs they had been praying for. Coaches saw new uniforms for their teams. No one questioned where the generosity came from. It felt comforting. It felt supportive. It felt like someone cared. But behind every act of kindness was a ledger stained with narcotics revenue. The cruelest irony was revealed when analysts examined a series of payments labeled Memorial Scholarship Funds. Each payment was tied to a victim of overdose. Families who had lost sons and daughters accepted donations meant to honor their memory, not knowing those funds came from the very organization responsible for flooding their communities with lethal substances. In the cold glow of evidence screens, this revelation hit harder than any raid. It showed a cartel willing to mourn victims it had created, using the grief of families as another shield against suspicion. The team then turned to structural mapping, converting the mountain of financial data into a living model. What emerged on the screens was more than a map. It was a circulatory system feeding an organism that stretched across counties and institutions. 4 major distribution corridors anchored the structure, each supported by legitimate businesses that appeared harmless on the surface. Beneath those corridors lay storage hubs, disguised inside cold food banks, agricultural cooperatives, and medical supply depots. Above them, the financial layer pulsed through casinos, shell companies, and non-profits. It was a system designed with elegance, efficiency, and frightening intelligence. But for all its complexity, the structure had flaws. The analysts began identifying them one by one. Certain departments showed unusual concentrations of influence centered around only a handful of individuals. Key contract approvals depended on the signatures of 2 or 3 mid-level administrators. Access to restricted facilities required authorization from the same limited group. Every path, no matter how wide or multi-layered, eventually funneled through a surprisingly small number of people. Remove those people, and the corridors collapsed. The cartel's empire was vast, but its scaffolding was fragile. Even so, the fragility offered little comfort. The team understood that what they were uncovering was not simply a financial scheme. It was a blueprint for capturing trust. By blending into the rhythms of everyday life, by sponsoring the very communities it was poisoning, by shaking hands with the leaders who believed they were partnering for good. The cartel had created an illusion so thorough that entire institutions had failed to recognize how deeply they had been compromised. The realization settled over the room like a weight that was impossible to lift. This was not a traditional criminal enterprise. It was a shadow version of the state itself, running parallel to legitimate authority, using its same tools, benefiting from its same protections, and slipping between its gaps with quiet precision. And yet, despite its size, the system was held together by human choices, by people who had exchanged duty for profit, integrity for convenience, and responsibility for silence. The next phase of the investigation would not involve breaching warehouses or intercepting shipments. It would involve stepping into offices where the carpets were still clean, where the coffee machines still hummed, where uniforms were neatly pressed and hung in lockers, where badges gleamed under fluorescent lights. The most dangerous work would unfold not under a night sky, but beneath the ordinary ceilings of municipal buildings, police precincts, administrative halls, and legislative offices. The analysts understood what this meant. The war was no longer about stopping drugs or dismantling supply lines. It was about confronting the people inside the system who had allowed everything to happen. And that kind of confrontation would not be loud. It would be quiet, surgical, inevitable. And it would change everything that Texas believed about itself. Dawn crept across Texas with a muted, uneasy light, the kind that settles over a place after something irreversible has already begun. The night raids had shattered the outer shell of the cartel's empire, and the financial analysis had revealed the architecture beneath it. But the true reckoning was waiting in the hours that followed, in the spaces where corruption lived behind official titles and familiar uniforms. The federal command knew that breaching warehouses was simple compared to what came next. The hardest doors to open were the ones that stood inside the institutions Texans trusted. By 7 in the morning, unmarked federal vans were already rolling toward police precincts, municipal buildings, and administrative offices across the state. There were no battering rams, no helicopters, no concussion grenades. These operations unfolded in daylight, with a stillness that made them feel more devastating than any night raid. Officers arrived for morning briefings carrying coffee and half-read newspapers, unaware that federal agents were already waiting in quiet hallways. Administrators unlocked their offices without realizing that warrants bearing their names were being prepared one floor below. In a precinct outside Dallas, the first arrest came with a silence so complete, it felt as though the building itself stopped breathing. A lieutenant with 20 years of service handed over his badge without speaking. His eyes locked on the floor as agents guided him toward the exit. In a county office near Beaumont, an administrator froze as agents opened a drawer containing envelopes of community outreach funds that, according to the new evidence, had been nothing more than pre-packaged bribe payments. In Houston, a procurement specialist known for his efficiency stared in disbelief as federal officers lifted entire binders of falsified contracts from his filing cabinets. For years, these men and women had appeared as protectors, as public servants, as pillars in their communities. Now they were being escorted out through front doors they had walked through with pride. Some colleagues looked away. Some stared with hollow disbelief. Others watched with a painful understanding, realizing that the uneasy feeling they had carried for months had finally taken shape. Outside, citizens gathered in small clusters, their expressions a mixture of anger, shock, and the slow erosion of trust. An elderly veteran stood on the sidewalk holding a folded flag he had once donated to the precinct. He did not shout or curse. He simply watched, his face marked with the quiet grief of someone who had believed deeply in the institutions now collapsing in front of him. By midday, the numbers spoke for themselves. 17 police officers, 2 municipal administrators, 1 high-level procurement advisor, dozens of support staff implicated through recovered financial links. It was not a flood of corruption. It was a network, a deliberate structure woven with precision into the routines of government life. And with every arrest, another piece of that structure broke apart. In Austin, the governor addressed the state with a calm gravity that cut through the political noise. His voice did not thunder or plead. It carried the weight of a leader standing over a fractured foundation. He announced the creation of the Texas Integrity Commission, an independent body with full authority to audit, investigate, subpoena, and dismantle corruption wherever it lived. No political loyalties, no party shields, no exemptions. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a necessary act of survival for institutions that had nearly collapsed under their own blind trust. The words he spoke were simple but definitive. When the shield is cracked, you do not turn away. You repair it. As the day unfolded, the state began to understand that the arrest of Michael Rivers had not been the climax of a scandal. It had been the warning flare, the first fissure in a dam that had strained under the weight of hidden rot. Now that the crack had widened, there was no returning to the illusion of safety. The raids, the evidence, the arrests, the confessions, they were not isolated events. They were a mirror held to the entire system, revealing how close it had come to losing itself. When night finally settled again, Texas found itself in a strange quiet. Not relief, not victory, not closure. It was the silence that comes after the truth is spoken aloud, when denial is no longer possible, and the only path forward is the difficult one. The state had faced something far more dangerous than drugs or guns. It had faced the betrayal of its own guardians, and yet it had not collapsed. It had chosen to fight, to expose, to cleanse. The war for integrity would not end with one night, or one arrest, or one commission. Corruption adapts, it hides, it waits. But now the state understood the cost of looking away, and that understanding had become its greatest weapon. Michael Rivers had not destroyed Texas. He had revealed what needed to be rebuilt, and the rebuilding had only just begun.